Hello listeners, welcome back to the podcast, and I hope you're doing fine today. Here's a brand new episode, and I'm joined by Alastair Budge, who is a returning guest on the podcast. He was on the show last year in episode number 825. Of course you remember that, everyone. That was the one where we talked about Alastair's time travel story called Pioneers of the Continuum. And video viewers, you can actually see I'm wearing the official t-shirt, a Pioneers of the Continuum t-shirt that Alastair generously gave to me. Pioneers of the Continuum is a sort of time travel adventure story that Alastair wrote and published as a podcast series and asked me to narrate. I'm the narrator of episode 1. You can find a link in the description if you'd like to listen to it, everyone. So anyway, last time we talked about Pioneers of the Continuum. We also talked about Alastair's experience of living in Malta, and we talked about sort of things like English immersions, the ways that people learn English in Malta, and also other stories like playing the bagpipes in France, busking in the street, playing the bagpipes. That was episode number 825. Now, Alastair is back on the podcast today because, well, I thought it would be interesting to explore some things that Alastair talks about in his main podcast, his first podcast, which, as many of you may know, is called English Learning for Curious Minds. Okay, listeners, do you know this podcast? Do you listen to it? Alastair is the host of this show, English Learning for Curious Minds. In that podcast, Alastair basically covers lots of really interesting true stories. He finds subjects and explores them in a lot of depth, does a lot of research, and then produces podcast episodes that kind of explore these subjects in detail, and they're for learners of English. So I thought it would be interesting to have Alastair back on the show to talk about one of the many subjects that he has researched while making episodes of his podcast. So hello Alastair, how are you doing today?
I am doing wonderfully. Thank you so much for having me back on the show, Luke.
It's a pleasure. And, well, first of all, you're in a different place now, because last time I spoke to you, you were in Malta. That's when you were on the podcast last time. But you've moved to a different country and everything now. Where are you?
Yeah, I'm actually in West Sweden, which is a very different part of the world compared to Malta.
Yeah, okay. And, well, what brought you to Sweden?
The same thing that brought me to Malta initially, my wife's job. So she works at the university, and she was offered a job in Gothenburg, which is the second largest city in Sweden. And we lived in Malta for 7 years. It's a very small place, Malta. And 7 years in a very small place with 2 small children. Thought it's probably time to go somewhere slightly different, somewhere slightly bigger, somewhere that you can't walk from one side to the other in an hour or so.
Yeah.
So yes, and you certainly can't walk from one side of Sweden to the other in an hour.
No. So how is Sweden then? Is it very different to Malta?
Yes, I think if you want a one-word answer to is it very different to Sweden to Malta? Yes, it is very different. In many ways. I mean, it's going from one tiny rock in the middle of the Mediterranean through to a huge kind of country full of beautiful wilderness in Northern Europe. It's a very different experience. We've only been here for a couple of months, so I am still getting my bearings, really trying to figure Sweden out. But so far, so good. I'd never actually been here before. I never got anywhere close to Sweden. So the first time that I arrived in Sweden was also the time that I moved here with my family. So it was a bit of on one level, a sort of leap into the unknown, but on another level, I don't know if you'd agree with me on this or not, but Sweden feels kind of familiar to some extent. I feel like as a Brit, it seems like a kind of a known unknown, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Something, somewhere, even if you haven't been there, you sort of have got a general sense of what it might be like, even if that sense is wrong. And yeah, there's definitely been some surprising things, but lots of things feel kind of familiar in a way that they didn't necessarily feel so familiar going to Malta at the start.
I feel like we've got quite a lot in common with the Swedes to an extent, and like we're not that far away from each other, like geographically, but also kind of culturally to an extent. But then again, it is not the same. So yeah, some things must be familiar and strangely familiar, and you feel like you've got a lot in common with the people and the culture, and then there must be other things that just don't quite seem normal, I suppose, for a Brit.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's lots of things that are absolutely wonderful about Sweden that I've seen so far. I mean, there's a few examples of things that exist in Sweden that I've just found myself thinking, why does that not work? Why does every country not have that? So I'll give you one like very basic example that I hope you will hear and think, that is a good idea. And this is not a kind of complicated thing to do or expensive in terms of, I don't know, the government has to pay lots of money for it. In the way that you send a letter in Sweden is you don't have to go to a post office and buy a stamp or whatever. There's actually an app for the equivalent of the Royal Mail or La Poste or whatever, where you can buy a stamp on the app. And my friend told me this, like, how do you buy a stamp on the app? Like, I don't have my phone doesn't come with a printer, or like, I don't want to have to go and print it out. Something this seems very unusual.
Yeah.
But you buy you buy postage, I guess, on the app, and then you're given a series of, I think it's 9 letters or numbers that you just write on the corner of a letter, and that is your postage, and it's valid for, like, I don't know, 7 days or something. And clearly they've got a way of scanning that and sort of checking that there's valid postage and things like that. So that was the kind of thing that I saw. I was like, that is just an all-round good idea.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think what's the flaw in that idea, and I can't think of it really, unless someone else sees the code written on a letter and they're like, "Ha! I'll take that code and I'll post it first." I don't know.
Yeah, I'd imagine that. I don't know. It's maybe you see someone in a cafe writing down the code, and you think, I know what, I'm just going to write a quick letter to someone and put that code in first, which would seem like an unusual crime to commit.
Yeah, I think so. Kind of a stupid crime, really, isn't it? Just sort of a pesky person stealing postage codes, looking over people's shoulders, and someone's writing a letter. Quickly write down the code on this envelope and quickly send this postcard before they get to the post box. Yeah.
Also, presumably, by the time someone gets to writing on the code, they're very close to posting it. So they finished writing the letter, they're folding it up. So you'd have to be very fast to go and buy a postcard.
Yeah.
Write down whatever you wanted. So I think that's not a huge problem here. I'm just going to... I don't know that for a fact, but I would imagine that kind of postage fraud is not of major concern for the Swedish government. Maybe it is.
Well, anyway, very interesting that they've... you just notice this little detail. It's interesting, these things that happen when you go and live in a different country. You notice these little things and they can strike you as being kind of big things in a way. And yeah, that does sound like a very good idea that the rest of the world could easily implement, and everyone could save a lot of time and effort by just getting rid of stamps completely. Pity though, because stamps are rather beautiful things. But anyway, we mustn't get sidetracked by stamps and postage codes in Sweden. Although it is interesting that you're living in a different place, and I wish you all the best with adjusting to a new culture again. So, tell me about your podcast again. So it's called English Learning for Curious Minds. How many episodes have you got at this point?
It'll be in a few months. It'll be 500, I think. So it's quite a lot. And some people ask me am I going to run out of stuff to talk about? And actually, there was a comment from someone. I did an episode on OnlyFans, the kind of history of OnlyFans, which is the kind of adult subscription marketplace. I think that's what it calls itself. Anyway, it's a place where you can pay to, access pictures of people not wearing many clothes.
Or none in some cases.
And I did an episode on that, and someone commented, "Man, you really have run out of topics, haven't you?" So,
well, it's. I'm surprised they weren't asking when you're going to set up your OnlyFans. I mean, that's the option that we all have, isn't it, as content creators? That when we finally run out of ideas, we can just be like, right, you know what? I'm just going to set up an OnlyFans, charge a lot of money, and for the 3 people who will sign up for it, it'll be worth it.
Start with pictures of the feet and just move upwards.
No, I think
stick with the feet.
They'd take one look at my feet and then they'd unsubscribe instantly, I think. So you did an episode about OnlyFans. You've done episodes on a variety of different things, so many different things.
I can say also just on the episode about OnlyFans that I deeply regret having done that, because as soon as I published it, all of the numbers on Spotify and other places just completely went down.
Really?
So I think I got sort of shadow banned or something for mentioning OnlyFans. So I was talking to someone else the other day, and they suggested that, in fact, the way that people get around these things is by referring to it in slightly different terminology, which I should have probably done. But I'm not an OnlyFans user, so I was not aware of what I should have done.
So possibly the platforms might have kind of suppressed your show because they were concerned that you were trying to sell your OnlyFans to people.
I believe that's what happened, because they just... I was asked, is there OnlyFans did you put the words OnlyFans anywhere? I said, well, probably like 20 times. It's in the title, it's in the description, it's linking to... leonardoenglish.com/OnlyFans, I think, something like that. So that was a lesson learned.
Okay, well now of course the algorithm is processing automatic subtitles for this episode right now. So the same thing's going to happen here. That this episode's going to get shadow banned as well, because the internet is just convinced that you're trying to sell your OnlyFans to the world. You've got no choice. You're just going to have to do it now. That's obviously the only thing you can do.
Destiny.
Anyway, so I thought that you could come back on the podcast so we could talk about one or more of the subjects that you've covered in your episodes. And so many different subjects, it was difficult to choose which one. We've ended up going for the story of Lord Lucan. We did mention it in passing last time you were on the show, and we thought that this time we could give it a lot more time and talk about it in a lot more detail. It's a fascinating story, and I should say, just to give context at the beginning, basically, listeners, the story of Lord Lucan, this is a very sort of British story, a completely true story, and in a nutshell, it's the story of an aristocrat who, in the 1960s, is this right? Did this happen in the 60s or 70s?
1970s.
Right.
The story takes place from the 60s to the 70s.
Yeah. Okay. So took place a few decades ago, but a British aristocrat who probably, we're not sure, it's an unsolved mystery, right? It's still unsolved, which is one of the fascinating things about it, and one of the reasons why people continue to talk about it and continue to be fascinated by it. So it's a British aristocrat, a member of the aristocracy, who was involved in a murder, a very nasty murder. He was involved in this murder and he disappeared. Right? And now people suspect that he committed the crime, but then he disappeared and he's never been seen since. Although there are lots of different theories and lots of different witness accounts or witness testimonies from people who say that they have seen him, but none of those things have been confirmed. So it's an unsolved mystery. So the aristocracy is one thing, and it's probably worth mentioning what this is. So listeners, you know we've got the royal family in the UK, but that royal family is at the very top of a system, which is a very traditional system, and a system which continues to this day. So we've got the royal family, but there are also various other people who are connected to the royal family in some way, like other families, other sort of aristocratic families. There's a whole network of aristocratic families. Okay, this is probably a good way. This is probably a good point at which I can hand over to you, Alastair. Can you tell us more about the story? Who was Lord Lucan? What happened? How did everyone react to it? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So that's a really good bit of background, I think, for people. So let's talk about the protagonist, our main guy, Lord Lucan. So he was born just before the war, World War II, and his early life was in many ways kind of typical of British aristocrats of his time. He was born in London, but he lived a very different life from most normal Londoners. So when there was the Blitz, and most children in London were sent out, evacuated, so that they weren't in danger when there was the bombing of London. He wasn't just sent to the countryside like most other children. He was sent all the way across the Atlantic, and he lived with some American millionaire, kind of swanning around, having a wonderful time. And then when he came back to the UK, again, he lived in a kind of parallel world compared to most people. He went to Eton, which people may be aware is a very famous and expensive private school where Prince William and Prince Harry both went. It's the kind of traditional place where young aristocrats go.
Yeah.
And it's importantly all boys.
Yeah. So he went to Eton. Yeah, very typical for an aristocrat to do. A British aristocrat is to go to one of these very exclusive schools. You mentioned that Eton is a private school. Actually, we describe these schools as public schools, which is fairly sort of counterintuitive, because you would imagine a public school means one that's one that's paid for by the government, a kind of state school. But in the UK, we've got public schools, private schools, and then state schools. And state schools are the ones that most, let's say, I don't know, normal people go to. Like most people go to state schools. These are the ones that are paid for by the government, right? And then private schools are ones that essentially you have to pay for. You have to pay to attend a private school. And then what we call public schools are essentially private schools, but they're just the most exclusive and most sort of high-level ones. And as you said, William and Harry both went to Eton, and also lots of other high-profile members of the establishment, let's say, sort of aristocratic people, but also maybe, sort of the sons of the most powerful people, richest people in the country. Yeah. And it's an all-boys school.
It's an all-boys school, and they all wear kind of long black coats. So if you picture a kind of British aristocrat who is 16 years old, and dress him up in a bit like a penguin, really, a sort of long black tails, that is the official school uniform of Eton. And especially when Lord Lucan was there, it was very much, the sons of the British aristocracy, right? Now it's slightly different. It's more on merit, and they have scholarships and things like that. It's more international. But back then, so we're talking in the 1950s, it was very much sort of the sons of the most titled people in the country. Not necessarily the richest people in the country. We're not talking about the sons of businessmen necessarily. It's really very much based on class. So that is the environment in which this man is growing up. And even at Eton, he got a bit of a reputation for being a rule breaker, someone who was not so keen on studying, and he developed three of his main vices that would stick with him for his entire life, really: smoking, drinking, and gambling. And there were reports from his schoolmasters complaining about the fact that he wouldn't go to class because he'd been up all night gambling with his friends. He'd bunked off school. He'd decided not to go to class because he wanted to put a bet on a race at Ascot, things like that. So he's already this kind of character who loves gambling, which will be important, doesn't like rules, or perhaps we can say doesn't think that the rules apply to him. And that's our guy, Richard John Bingham. And then after school, when he finishes, he, I guess, like lots of his friends from the school, would have joined the army. But we're not talking about someone who is coming in at a low level as a private, kind of fighting on the front lines, or that would be called to fight up on the front lines. He comes in as an officer type figure. So his days are much more likely to be spent, or probably actually, let's not talk about his days. His evenings would be spent in the officers' mess, the kind of dining canteen, gambling and drinking and smoking, and kind of living the kind of life of an aristocrat while pretending to be a soldier, really.
Yeah, so as someone in that privileged position, yeah, he would have joined the army, as you said, but yeah, exactly, not as a private who would have been, marching up and down and being shouted at. But yeah, it's extraordinary, really, that kind of level of privilege existed, and arguably still exists. That's because he was who he was, because he had this title, because he was from an aristocratic family, he was essentially just allowed to kind of become an officer and not really do anything, not really kind of do any actual soldiering. It's just crazy, really.
Well, you say it's kind of great, and arguably still exists. I mean, Prince William and Harry, they both went into the army, doing a similar kind of thing. The Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, was doing a similar kind of thing as well. It might seem strange for people who are not so familiar with the UK and the kind of things that royals or aristocrats do, but it's quite a well-trodden path for someone to go and be a soldier, be an officer in the army for a certain period. Well, you kind of learn a bit of order and kind of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But as you might imagine, it didn't last long in the case of Lord Lucan, because even if he was having a lot of fun and gambling and that kind of stuff, he didn't like the structure of the army. Then, so what happened next? Oh yeah, let me tell you a little bit more about what he looked like, because this is kind of important.
Mm-hmm.
He was very tall. He was very tall. He was 6'4", which is about 1.95 meters, I think. Someone with a calculator can probably do the exact calculations, but he was quite tall. Okay. He was very handsome, and he had a big bushy moustache. So he's the kind of person that you would recognize if you saw him on the street, which will be important for later on in our story.
Right.
Anyway, so he's a tall, dark, and handsome guy. If you found the exact centimeters.
Yeah. So as we say, 6'4", which is the kind of the British way of describing someone's height, means 6'4" is 193 centimeters, basically.
Okay. I was 2 centimeters off, but roughly, he was tall at least.
Yeah.
I hope you'll forgive the addition of 2 centimeters to Lord Lucan's height. Anyway,
That's all right.
so he quits the army, and he becomes a banker for a little bit, a merchant banker, which today we'd probably call investment banker. But he's not the kind of person working 18 hours a day in some large skyscraper in the city of London. He's there sort of shaking people's hands and going for large lunches and kind of doing business with his friends. But throughout the whole of this, throughout the time in the army and also throughout the time that he was working in this bank, he was still a huge gambler. And the sums were getting larger and larger and larger. And he would, he'd wager vast amounts of money playing baccarat and bridge and all those kinds of stuff. He was apparently a very skilled gambler, but if as with any gambler, you don't. Even if you're very skilled, you normally end up losing quite a lot of money.
Yeah, because the house always wins ultimately.
The house always wins, and he kind of had this reputation as a big player, someone who would spend a lot of money and would constantly have to be bailed out by his friends. They would have to say, "Oh, don't worry, I'll cover for Lord Lucan," and he'd kind of oscillate from having lots of money to having no money at all and not being able to repay his debts. He really seemed to be this character who did everything by extremes, right? He wasn't the kind of person who'd say, "Oh, tonight I'll just stay in and watch some TV" or something like that. It would always be, "I'm going out and I'm gonna make a lot of money." So I think what we should talk about next is his wife. So we are in the late 1950s in London.
So I was going to say he sort of occupies the kind of James Bond-ish kind of world, doesn't he?
Exactly. So it's what he's doing with his life is really kind of going from private members club to private members club, going to dinners, driving around in a soft top Aston Martin, so an expensive sports car. He's very good looking, and he can be found kind of going around Europe. Sort of, if you imagine a James Bond film from the 1960s, that is essentially his life. That's what he's doing.
It's like James Bond on a day off, like normally in a James Bond film, we discover him at the beginning of the film and he's not doing if those movies where at the beginning he's not working, he's just driving around, maybe like doing a bit of gambling, picking up some girls or whatever. And then like the government gives him a job and off he goes and he sort of like does all the James Bond spy stuff. But this is Lord Lucan's life looks like James Bond when he doesn't have a job. It's just James Bond, between movies, let's say. Yeah.
And the one anecdote that I saw in an interview with his wife, who we'll talk about in a minute, was she was describing the time that they met, or rather they got together, and I think they were having a lunch, and he had offered to drive her home after the lunch in his Aston Martin, of course. And I guess one imagines they'd been sort of exchanging a few glances and that kind of stuff. And then he drove her home. I think he asked her if she'd like to come upstairs for a cup of tea or something. And apparently they just went upstairs. He picked up the phone and said, "Boys, I won't be coming to the club this evening."
Yeah. Okay, so this gives us an idea of the sort of person that he was and the life and world that he lived in. You were about to tell us about his wife before I mentioned James Bond. Yeah.
Yes. So he met his wife, I think, in 1957. It was a whirlwind romance, and kind of her role, really, as far as he saw it, was to to sort of to provide children, because of course if you're a aristocrat, then you need to have an heir, a male heir, for the title to pass down, and really to sort of get out of the way and let him continue to live his playboy lifestyle. And
What a different world, and yeah, it just gives you an idea of what it must have been like for women in that society, where basically, first of all, you just get picked up by some guy who calls his friends, "I won't be coming to the club tonight, guys," and she's like, "Excuse me, do I not get any say in this?" And then yeah, her job is just to give him children and just stay out of his way. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was an interview with her where she describes their honeymoon, and they went on this, I think it was to Venice, Monte Carlo, or somewhere like that, but very expensive honeymoon, presumably going to lots of lovely places. And apparently he just didn't talk to her for the entire trip, and this was not like he was upset with her that she'd done anything wrong. And then she asked him, why will you not talk to me? And he essentially said, like, a husband doesn't need to talk to his wife. We don't need to talk. You are there serving a purpose, and your purpose is to produce children and to not interfere with what I want to be doing, which is going to the club with my boys, and gambling. And just to add also, I realized when I said going to the club with my boys, someone in 2024 might listen to that and think that he's going to, I don't know, like a nightclub, a sort of disco, and that he's dancing and stuff. No, what this would mean is he would be there in his black tie, dressed up like James Bond, and he would drive down in his Aston Martin to his private members club, and the club he would go to is one called the Claremont Club. I'll tell you about this club in a minute, but he would be there until late in the evening, just gambling, drinking, and kind of speaking with other men of a similar kind of class and background and stuff. This is not the kind of club that anyone could just walk into. You had to be recommended by someone. And in fact, the Claremont Club, the club that he kind of adopted as his own, was owned or opened by a guy called someone Aspinall. I can't remember the first name. Mm-hmm. Anyway, was opened by this slightly eccentric aristocrat, of course, who had his own zoo with tigers and other kind of exotic animals. And this will be important for later on. But Aspinall got this sort of reputation as someone who would always be at the Claremont Club. And he was, it seems like he loved being there, even though he would lose lots of money. But he was also used a little bit as a way to kind of attract people to the club, because they see Aspinall, putting down bets of what would be hundreds of thousands of pounds in today's money. And he was kind of used by the club to attract people, other high spenders in. Anyway, so where were we? We get to the where are we? The early 1960s, and you have Lord Lucan married now, and he has 3 children. So his wife has done what she was brought in to do, really, if we have to be so crude and businesslike about it.
Yeah.
But he has not changed his habits. He's not kind of settled down or anything like that. And he has lots of financial problems because he's gambling so much. I mean, we think of him being this hugely rich man, which of course he was, but he's spending money just as quickly as he brings it in. And one evening, apparently, he has this huge win. He wins, I think it was £20,000 back then, which is the equivalent of something like £200,000 in today's money. A very, very large amount of money. And he decides, he says, well, why am I working in a bank for, what's obviously a good salary, but nothing compared to what I can win in an evening at the card table. So he quits his job, and he's essentially a professional gambler now, which his wife didn't like. So I imagine most people's partners wouldn't like it if they were professional gamblers, because your income is as variable as variable can be. And she wanted a more traditional life, as I imagine most people would, but he was not prepared to give it to her. And then a year later, I think a year after they were married, his father died. Now, this is important because it means that he inherits the title of being Lord Lucan. So before, he was just... Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask you a question. Sorry to interrupt you. That I'm wondering if other people are thinking this too. So his title at this point becomes Lord Lucan, even though his name is Richard John Bingham. Bingham is his surname, but he becomes Lord Lucan. Why was his title Lucan rather than Bingham?
So I don't know exactly where the Lucan is. I would imagine it's a
place,
a small place. What is traditional for titled aristocrats in UK is you have your name, and then you'd be the Duke or the Earl of a different place.
Yeah.
Which normally would it's normally linked to some kind of historical connection with that place. So, for example, Prince William is he the Duke of which one's the Duke of Cornwall? I always get confused. One is...
Well, they've all changed, haven't they?
They all change.
Maybe we can use Downton Abbey as an example, right? Downton Abbey could be a useful example. We could also refer to the royal family. But in Downton Abbey, you've got the Earl of Grantham, who is the main character, the main lord of this house called Downton Abbey. His name is Robert Crawley. So that's his actual name, Robert Crawley. People would call him Lord Crawley. And his title was the Earl of Grantham. And I suppose Grantham was the place, right, where Downton Abbey was located. Yeah. So Prince William, this is from Wikipedia. William, Prince of Wales, has received numerous titles, decorations and honorary appointments, both during his time as Duke of Cambridge and Prince of Wales. Okay, so previously William was the Duke of Cambridge and Kate was the Duchess of Cambridge, but now they, since the Queen died and the order changed and Charles became king and Camilla became queen, William became the Prince of Wales, and I guess that means that Kate is the Princess of Wales. Anyway, the point is that a person's title in the aristocracy is connected to a location, it's connected to a place. And so Lord Lucan, the Lucan part of that title refers to a place, and his actual name was Bingham. So there we go.
So, and I guess the point is that if Luke and I are trying to figure out how these titles work, it really makes little sense. It's a very confusing element of the aristocracy, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense anyway. But yeah, so Lord Lucan, or rather Bingham, now becomes Lord Lucan,
right?
And he also has this nickname of Lucky Lucan, which he got after this huge gambling win that allowed him to quit his job. And then when his father dies, he gets the title. He becomes Lord Lucan, or Lucky Lucan, and he also inherits a lot of money, which clearly he was very happy about, because it meant he was able to gamble more. And as you might imagine, he did not decide, okay, that's enough, I'm going to live a good, honest life. Now, a more traditional life, perhaps I should say. He just starts gambling more and more and more. And as this is all happening, his relationship with his wife is just breaking down. It seems like it was never really a happy one to begin with. If you look at photos of them, they're always kind of looking cross with each other or just grumpy. They're never very close. And she starts to kind of loathe him, and the feeling seems to be mutual. She was diagnosed with I think postnatal depression after the birth of her third child, and this sort of spirals into serious, what we would now call, I'm sure, mental health problems. She's clearly very unhappy with her life and with him. And both she and he are also very absent parents for their three children. If people listening or watching this have seen Mary Poppins, the Disney, I think it's Disney, yeah, Disney film, they'll know that Mary Poppins is the nanny to two children of the Bankses. I can't remember what their names are. Anyway, there's a sort of aristocratic man and his wife, and they have a nanny, Mary Poppins, who looks after the children. And at this time, this kind of time, even in the 20th century, mid 20th century, the way in which the parenting would have worked for people like the Lucans would be that the nanny basically did everything, and then the mother and father would perhaps sort of say hello to the children at breakfast, and they would maybe kind of pat them on the head before they went to bed. It was not a particularly close relationship in terms of hands-on time with the children. I imagine Lord Lucan and probably even Lady Lucan were not doing huge amounts of nappy changing or dealing with anything to do with the children that was outside very strict hours. So they would have a nanny, and even they would go on holiday without the children. There's an interview with Lady Lucan where she describes how they would go to Monte Carlo and go to Venice, and the interviewer says, "Oh, what happened to the children?" And she says, they would just be left with a nanny. Completely matter of factly, as if there was, nothing that was in any way unusual about this, because in the circles that they moved in, there wasn't anything unusual about that. That was how children were brought up. There was a nanny, and the nanny did all of those kinds of things. Maybe on a language note, for people who don't know what a nanny is, it's a kind of live-in babysitter. So someone who's typically a young woman who would go and live with the family permanently, and would do all the stuff with the children. And the nanny will become a crucial part of the story later on.
Her name, by the way, was Sandra Rivet. Yeah, it's probably worth mentioning her name. And there is actually a new Amazon Prime documentary film about her life. Yes.
In fact, they actually had multiple different nannies, and Sandra Rivet only appears slightly later on.
Oh, really? Okay.
She was only with the family, I think, for 9 weeks.
I see.
Before the events that we'll talk about.
Okay.
They'd had the children otherwise grew up with nannies.
Yeah.
And then when the parents' relationship completely broke down, there was a sort of messy separation. There was a battle over the custody of the children, and it seems like when this relationship really broke down and Lord Lucan moved out, it only seemed like it was then that the two parents decided, okay, we actually we want to start looking after our children and be slightly more active with our parenting. But of course, there was this battle over who was going to have custody of the children, and it seemed like it was a very messy court battle. They'd hired expensive solicitors, expensive lawyers. There was all sorts of stuff that was aired that Lady Lucan talked about in the courtroom. Even kind of sexual habits and things that Lord Lucan took huge offence to, thinking this is private business. It shouldn't be talked about publicly. And Lord Lucan had done lots of nasty things in terms of having Lady Lucan followed, and it was just a very nasty breakup, and also very expensive. I think it cost. I think it was £20,000 back then. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds in 2024 money. And in the end, the judge ruled that Lady Lucan should have custody of the children, but with the condition that they hire a nanny, because she was deemed to not be mentally stable enough to look after 3 children on her own.
Right.
And she hadn't really had any experience doing it, because there had always been another nanny.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they hire this young lady called Sandra Rivet, who is not an aristocrat. She's just a normal former hairdresser, I believe. And so you have this situation where Lady Lucan and the 3 children and the nanny are living in this large house in an area of London called Belgravia, which is now one of the most exclusive, most expensive areas of London. I looked earlier, and a house there is kind of between like £6 and £10 million now. It's a huge amount of money, and it would only really be affordable for someone who was, a very successful banker or had their own large company or something like that. It's probably even out of reach for someone like Lord Lucan today.
It's not far from Buckingham Palace. It's just a few streets away
No.
from Buckingham Palace. Yeah.
And importantly, these kinds of houses, I can actually give you the address because you can look it up on Street View. It's on Lower Belgrave Street. But they tend to be tall and thin. So they will normally have kind of 4 or perhaps 5 stories, and they'll go up like this.
Yeah.
For people who are watching on YouTube, I was trying to just showing how a house goes up.
Yeah,
but
basically, Alastair's just demonstrating with his hands a kind of a tall, narrow building, 4 or 5 stories, 4 or 5 floors, but
Exactly.
quite narrow. Yeah.
Typically with a kitchen at the bottom, which will be kind of sunk a little bit below the street, and this will also be important for later on.
Yeah.
And Lord Lucan has moved out. He's in a small house nearby. And if we can try and think a little bit more about his mental state or what's going on at the time. He's the kind of person who clearly has been very used to just getting his way throughout his life. He's never had to deal really with the real world. He's always been given lots of money, lots of titles. Sure, he's lost gambling a bit, but clearly he's a complete addict. And life has always kind of gone his way, really. And then suddenly he's lost his wife, he's lost custody of his children, and he's also faced with this huge legal bill for the court case over the custody of his children. So that is where we are at the moment, and we are now in 1974. So London in the 1970s, and Sandra Rivet, the nanny, has just joined, and by all accounts, she was a very good nanny, a very kind, completely innocent person. And on the evening of the 7th of November, 1974, the family, the Lucan family, minus Lord Lucan, of course, they are at home. It's a Thursday evening, I believe. And Lady Lucan is upstairs watching TV with her eldest daughter. And she normally always goes down to make a cup of tea before bed. It's about 9 o'clock in the evening. And instead, Sandra Rivet, the nanny, offers to make one for her. So she says, of course, that would be lovely. And so Sandra Rivet goes downstairs, all the way down to the basement where there's the kitchen. And then the Lady Lucan is still upstairs with her daughter, thinking, where's my tea? And then 5 minutes goes by, and 10 minutes goes by, and there's still no tea. And she thinks, this is unusual. And she calls down and says, Sandra, but there's no sound. So she goes down the stairs, and we're probably talking, I don't know, 5 or 6 different flights of stairs here, because she's right at the top and she's going all the way down this very tall house. And as she gets to the bottom, she tries to turn on the light, but she flicks the switch and nothing happens. So she thinks this is unusual. It was working earlier on, and she keeps on going down. And then as she's going down the stairs, she feels a huge smack on the head, and there's someone there who is fighting her. He seems to have some kind of weapon, some stick or pipe of metal, something like that, and it seems to be attacking her. And so she fights back. She's a small, kind of skinny lady, but she's clearly fighting for her life, and she's kind of putting her fingers down this man's throat. She grabs him by his testicles, and manages to push him off.
Yeah.
And it's then that she looks at him and she sees Lord Lucan. She sees her husband.
Yeah.
And she says, "Well, what are you doing?" And he says, "I've killed the nanny." By the way, I should say this is her account. Okay,
this is her account. Yeah,
this is her account of what is happening, which is the only account we have. So I will tell it with that. With that information.
Yeah.
So he apparently is covered in blood and says, "I've killed the nanny," and she kind of thinks on her feet. She thinks quickly, and she says, "Okay, no worries. We can sort it."
Yeah.
She probably didn't say no worries. Sorry, no worries.
No, but the point is that she decides, okay, I'll sort of pretend to go along with it, right? I suppose.
I'll help you clear up this mess.
Yeah, she's afraid for her life here, so she's trying to find a way to make sure that he doesn't kill her, because he's just attacked her, so she's in panicked survival mode at this point. And so she quickly comes up with a plan, which is like, "Oh, okay, I'll help you. Yeah.
And she's also been beaten pretty badly. She's been hit around the head. She must be in a lot of pain, but she's still, she's still thinking clearly enough to try and figure a way out of this situation. And remember, she's small. He is a large man, and so she's presumably thinking, "There's no way that I can, fight him off. That I can get out of here. Also, I'm at the basement. I'm on the bottom floor."
Yeah.
So she suggests to Lord Lucan, she says, "Let's sort this together. Let's go and clean up the body, and then we'll go and dispose of it."
Yeah.
So they go and they find the body of Sandra Rivet, the nanny who has been beaten to death, and they put it in a postage sack. So one of those bags that is normally used for letters.
Yeah.
They managed to get the body into the sack, and then he says, "Let's go upstairs, and kind of get you cleaned up." And he asks her if she has any sleeping pills, and I ask her to take some sleeping pills, and she thinks what he wants to do is for her to either fall asleep so that he can suffocate her or kill her or something like that, on the bed, and she says, no problem, here we go, I'm going to take them. And then she encourages him to go to the bathroom to wash his hands. So she's on the bed pretending that she's going to be his accomplice here. He goes to the bathroom, starts washing his hands, and you can kind of imagine the scene. He's there covered in blood, and presumably very flustered. And the water's running, so there's background noise.
Yeah.
And that she sees this as her opportunity to hurry down the stairs as fast as possible. She runs out of the house, and she goes straight out of the house and runs all the way to a pub nearby. And yeah, it's about 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening, 10 o'clock by this time. And you can imagine the scene, that there's a whole lot of people in the pub. Presumably a different type of person in the pub in 1974 than would be in a pub in Belgravia now. We're talking about just normal people who are just having a few drinks, maybe playing darts or that kind of stuff.
Not the sort of aristocratic set that Lord Lucan would normally be socialising with. These are just like your sort of ordinary locals.
Exactly. I'm sure Lady Lucan and Lord Lucan never ever went to that pub, despite living, a few hundred meters from it for 10 years. So she runs into this pub, kind of covered in blood, and sort of shouts like, "Help! My husband attacked me!" And you can imagine a whole lot of people kind of drinking their pints and looking around and being very surprised to see someone like Lady Lucan in that pub, obviously covered in blood.
Because they would know her as well. They'd probably know who she was, or at least some of them might.
They might do. They certainly be surprised at how she would talk, because she was sort of, my husband has been attacking me, or something like that.
She sounded like a character from The Crown, kind of thing. Yeah. Help! My husband's been attacking me.
Yeah.
What's that? What's going on? What's this commotion over the other side of the bar? Help! Someone's help! My husband's been trying to attack me.
Yeah. So the police are called, and then they go to the house, and they find the body of this poor nanny, Sandra Rivet, but no sign of Lord Lucan, no sign of anyone else.
Right. I just needed to say at this point, because I've been listening very closely to the story, and I'm wondering what the audience are thinking, and I've got a funny feeling that there are lots of people out there listening at this point going, why? But why? Why did he do it? Why did he kill the nanny, and why did he attack his wife? And is this maybe too early to answer this question?
I think it's just the right point to give some ideas about why someone might have done it, but because maybe let's not point the finger at Lord Lucan just yet. Although there'll be plenty of time for finger pointing in a minute.
Because again, that's just based on the wife's testimony at this point. Him confessing, him being there, him saying, "I killed the nanny," him essentially confessing to his wife. It's still not entirely proven. So these are, I guess, still allegations at this point, because it's never actually been proven in a court of law or decided. Yeah. So
the wife's theory about why he killed the nanny was because he was trying to kill her. He was not. The nanny was a complete innocent bystander in the whole event.
Yeah.
She normally didn't work on a Thursday evening. It was her day off. So he would have assumed that the nanny would not be in the house. He knew that his wife always made a cup of tea before she went to bed, and so he also had the keys for the house, of course.
Yeah.
So what people think happened is that he let himself in quietly. He removed the light from the socket so that it would be dark in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And that explains why when she tried to turn it on, there was no light.
Yeah.
And then he hid and lay in wait. And then when he saw a woman coming down the stairs, he just assumed it was his wife because it was the most likely thing, right? He's always been a person who dealt with probabilities, right? He's thinking, it seems very unlikely that it's going to be anyone other than my wife because the nanny doesn't work on Thursdays. He didn't realize that her hours had changed, and so she was working that evening. And it also was just unusual for her to be coming down in the night. Yeah. So the theory about why it could have been Lord Lucan was because he was furious about his wife winning the battle of the custody of the children.
Yeah.
He wanted the children back. He was very annoyed with her for having aired some of the more intimate details of their marriage in public. And he also, if we go back to his time Eton in the army, when he was just breaking all the rules and not going to lessons and stuff like that, clearly he was the kind of person who thought that normal rules didn't really apply to him, and if he could kill his wife and could dispose of her body, if there was no evidence, then he would get away with it. That she would just be a disappeared woman.
Do you think that he would have got away with it? Because there's possibly a chance that he actually would have done if he hadn't made such a mess of it. If, assuming that it was him, right? If he had actually managed to kill his wife, I think there's quite a good chance that he would have somehow got away with it because of the sheer injustice of that world and the way that someone like him essentially almost is above the law, or at least has everything on their side, in the sense that the entire establishment, is kind of is going to have his back. You could imagine that someone else could get charged for it, that he would somehow find a way, that he'd have a connection to some judge somewhere. The corruption of that kind of level of prejudice could result in him getting away with it. Yeah,
I think he certainly thought he would get away with it. I think this was not a crime committed out of anger or without prior thought or consideration about what would happen. He had brought a postal sack.
Yeah.
So he brought a way to carry the body. He had also, as we'll find out later, he'd also borrowed a friend's car, so that there would be no way that the body could be traced back to his own car. And he was one of his kind of vices or James Bond-esque hobbies was he would race powerboats. And so he was, what people think is that he was planning to drive, kill the wife, then drive down to the coast, get in one of these boats, and then dump the body in the English Channel.
Yeah, in the
so
sea.
That is the theory. And if that had happened, and there was nothing to tie him to the crime scene, then he probably would have got away with it. Or even if there was some sort of evidence, given his strong connections and his status as an aristocrat, in all probability, he would have got away with it.
Yeah. The poor nanny as well. I mean, first of all, like the two women, completely just the victims of this horrendous situation, but that poor nanny, it's just heartbreaking. I say poor women, certainly the nanny, because she seems to be completely innocent party. I mean, I don't know what Lady Lucan was like, and we're just taking her version of the story, but in any case, Lord Lucan does seem to be the villain here, despite the fact that this is called the story of Lord Lucan. He seems to be the bad guy protagonist, and you could equally kind of tell this story from different points of view. In fact, that seems to be what this latest Amazon Prime documentary seems to do, because there's this new Amazon Prime documentary which might not be available everywhere, but it's called The Murder of Sandra Rivet. So clearly they've taken a slightly different point of view and focused on the victim, which it's always the case in these sorts of stories that it's like with Jack the Ripper or something. We always talk about the perpetrator and make them the centre of attention, and perhaps they don't deserve that, considering what they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're completely right. I guess the problem is that for Sandra Rivet, she presumably thought she was just going to have a nice, normal nanny job. She was not she's not kind of telling people about all these funny things that were going on. I don't know much about her backstory before she became a nanny to the family. I would imagine it's just a very normal life, without anything that is not, of course, not without anything that's noteworthy. But she's not, she's not inheriting a title. She's not being living in this completely bizarre bubble that Lord Lucan and to a certain extent Lady Lucan lived in. So it is unfortunate that she's often an afterthought in the whole story. And hopefully that new documentary will be. I'll certainly watch it.
Yeah.
I think it could be interesting.
So let's get back into the story then. So where we left it was that Lady Lucan runs into this pub covered in blood. She's probably hysterical. She's telling everyone that her husband has tried to kill her.
And then afterwards, she says, "Oh, and he's killed the nanny as well." So clearly, the nanny to her was an afterthought compared to her own attack. So poor Sandra Rivet. Anyway, the police are called, and of course, Lord Lucan is the main suspect because there's a witness saying it was Lord Lucan, and he had a clear motive, as we talked about. So they try to go and find him, and they can't find him. But it turns out that he has made a few phone calls directly after the murder, one of which was to his mother, where apparently he sounded completely incoherent. And he...
Incoherent, meaning that she couldn't really understand what he was talking about. That's interesting. I wonder what his state of mind was, because clearly, I mean, if we assume this main version of events and we assume that he's done it, the motives being essentially sort of like revenge, like it's premeditated. It's fully premeditated because, as you mentioned, he had the sack and he prepared all these things. He had the weapon, he did the light bulb and those things. But a kind of like dark motive in the sense that it's like pure hatred and revenge for the things that she said during the separation trial, and the fact that she'd won the case and got custody of the kids, and he was like, things didn't go his way, and he just thought, right, well, I'll just make them go my way.
It's interesting to think about the extent to which it was kind of revenge against her versus practical, this is the way that she's going to get out of the way, that I can sort the problem. And clearly it is an unacceptable way to sort the problem by killing someone. But it sounds like at this stage, Lord Lucan was, he just felt like he was completely above the law. And that if he wanted to get rid of his wife, he tried to do it the legal way, through the law courts. Also, multiple times he tried to get her sectioned, which means that he had tried to get her committed to a mental facility. I don't know what is the political correct way of saying that, but he tried to get her. There's an act, a British law called the. Maybe there's multiple laws, but there's something called the Mental Health Act, and I think people are sectioned under the Mental Health Act, where people in white coats come and say, "All right, Luke, come with us. You're not deemed to be capable of being a fit and active member of society." By the way, I just got to change the subject very, very slightly to say I always recommend people watch Peep Show. Are you a Peep Show fan?
Yeah, definitely. Of course.
Do you know the one where the two characters keep on trying to get each other sectioned
I don't
under
remember
the Mental
that
Health Act? It's such a good episode.
Jeremy and Mark.
Anyway, that is a funny story, and this is not a funny story.
So, but anyway, that is an expression, though, to be sectioned, which involves that person being essentially obliged to go into care because of the condition of their mental health. Yeah, they're taken away and put into care.
And it's something that Lord Lucan had tried multiple times to have done to his wife. So when trying to think about what might have been his mental state that evening, he's in his mind, he's tried everything to get the situation back as he would like it to be back with his children.
And I was trying to say that he was incoherent on the phone to his mother, and obviously acting in an extreme way that maybe, I mean, we talked about his wife's mental health, but maybe Lucan at this point was, I don't know, I wonder what state of mind he was in, considering his lifestyle, considering the amount that he drank, the stress that he'd been under with the separation from his wife and all the rest of it, 3 kids. He was probably losing it too, right?
Yeah, and I think he probably thought that he had this master plan of, I'm going to kill the wife and it's all going to be perfect. And presumably he'd just imagined what this future would be like the following day. But poor Sandra Rivet had come down instead.
Yeah.
And now he had this huge problem of the murdering of an innocent person. I don't know if he was so concerned with Sandra Rivet herself. It was probably more oh God, this is messed up my plan, because now there's my wife and what do I do now? I've got no idea.
Yeah.
And the one thing that his mother did say that he told her in the phone call was something about the fact that he'd interrupted another man attacking his wife. And then she had mistakenly thought that it was him, but actually it was another man. So it might sound a little bit implausible, but that was what he would claim. And then it turned out also that evening, he'd tried to call his mother, spoken with her briefly, and then he'd driven to first a friend's house, and the friend wasn't there, but the friend's wife was, and he'd stayed up with her and tried to explain what had happened. And he repeated this story that he was walking past the house, and he had seen another man attacking his wife in the basement. So, basement being right under street level.
Yeah. And
so he'd got into the house, and then he'd rescued his wife from this other man, but she'd thought that the man who was attacking him was the husband. And that all the stuff that I told you earlier about him saying, "Oh, I killed the nanny," that was not something that he had done, apparently. So in his account, he interrupted someone else killing the nanny and then attacking the wife, but this someone else was nowhere to be seen. There was no sign of a break-in, no nothing. So it's the police almost immediately said, that's just not true.
That's clearly untrue. Yeah. Yeah.
And there was this huge hunt for Lord Lucan. And apparently initially the police thought that he would, present himself at the station the following day with a solicitor to say, this is what's happened and this is my lawyer and so on. But then days went on and on and on and on, and there was no sign of Lord Lucan. And clearly he was the main suspect in the murder. People were looking all over for him. There was a manhunt, but no one saw him. No one reported seeing him. And remember, he's a big guy. He's very conspicuous. He's very easy to see. He's very handsome. He's got this big bushy moustache, and presumably he would also have been in a slightly strange state at the time. And then 3 weeks later, there is a breakthrough when the police found the car that he had driven in the port of New Haven. It's on the south coast, basically opposite from France. For the French listeners, if you know where Le Havre is. It's right on the south coast,
Not far from Brighton.
and it's a kind of fishing town, that kind of stuff. There would be a little beach, and lots of boats would set off from there. So they found this car, and in it didn't look very good for Lord Lucan, because they found a lead piping, bloody lead piping.
That's a kind of metal bar or metal pipe made of heavy metal
Exactly.
lead.
If people are familiar with the board game Cluedo, which I think has different names in different languages. I can't remember.
Yeah, in the States and in Canada they call it Clue. In the UK we call it Cluedo. It might have different names in other countries, but it's this classic kind of murder mystery board game which has these different characters. It all takes place in a sort of Downton Abbey style country manor house. There's a victim, and there are weapons, including a dagger, a pistol, and a lead pipe, a piece of lead piping. Yes,
exactly. And the objective of the game is to see who was the murderer, where did it take place, and with what. Mm-hmm. So with this, very real murder mystery, there was the murder weapon, the lead piping, which is also a murder weapon in the game. So they found the murder weapon. They found traces of blood, I think, also all over the car, and it was Lord Lucan's car, but still no sign of Lord Lucan at all. So people started wondering, what's happened to him. They thought, but because the car was parked near, or I should say, as close as you can get to France, they thought, has he got on a boat and sailed over to France? Has he killed himself in some way? Is he being hidden by one of his wealthy aristocratic friends? And this was in 1974, and still to this day, nobody has found out where Lord Lucan is or was, or maybe I should say there's been no further trace of Lord Lucan.
So it appears he just drove his car down to the south coast, abandoned the car, and just disappeared, and we think no one has ever seen him since, or certainly the police never caught him.
Yeah, so to this day, there has been no official sighting of him. But of course, it was huge news at the time. For the entire 3 weeks after the murder, there was, it was all over the news. There was this big hunt for Lord Lucan. And I think people sort of assumed that he would turn up, that he would hand himself in, or that there would be some kind of clue that he was living in the large estate of some aristocrat in Scotland or something like that. But he didn't. And then there was this car, this kind of extra clue. That was the fact it was so close to the sea got people asking questions about what might have happened, because it's perfectly possible that he could have got on a boat and sailed to France. At that, from New Haven to France, I guess it's 5 hours or so, even on a relatively small boat. And he was well known to be, to know his way around boats. He sailed boats, he sailed speedboats, and he probably had a boat in New Haven.
Yeah.
The theory is that what his plan was kill the wife, put her in the postage sack, take her down in the car that was the friend's car, so it wouldn't be linked to him, down in the car to New Haven, put her into a boat, and then take her out to sea and dump her with some weights or something, so that nobody would ever find her.
Yeah.
But of course, the wife escaped. So ever since then, people have been wondering what happened to Lord Lucan. And I can even remember when I was growing up. So I was born in 1987. So this is 13 years after this all happened. But still, what I can remember in the newspapers and on the news and things, there'll be some little segment about Lord Lucan being spotted in Goa or in Australia or South Africa or all over the world. There were sightings of Lord Lucan.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I'm 10 years older than you, and it's exactly the same. Lord Lucan is a name living in the UK that just pops up sometimes. And I remember hearing my mum and dad talking about the story. I remember just, when you're a kid, you just pick up on these things. Like it would be mentioned on the radio, or it would be mentioned on TV, or there'd be a story in the newspaper, and it would get my parents talking about it, and they would talk about it, they'd speculate about it and stuff. And so it's kind of like part of common culture, just the name Lord Lucan, the disappearance, the mystery of Lord Lucan. Where is he? People make jokes about it. So, Lord Lucan, like people sort of mention it in passing. You'll be in the pub with a few people and someone will start talking about it or make a comment about it. So it's something that in the UK is like really, really well known.
Yeah, and it seemed like it was, every year there was a new sighting of Lord Lucan, and I read a few articles with journalists talking about this phenomenon, I guess, of people just reporting sightings of Lord Lucan.
Yeah.
And they were always happy to go and investigate them, because the journalist was happy to go. If your boss says, Luke, can you go and spend 5 days in Goa, all expenses paid, whatever. Just you got to go around and ask locals in bars, have you seen Lord Lucan? You're probably going to say that's better than going to report on a power station in Aberdeen.
Because you get to a free trip to India, and you get to spend time at the beach, and you get to travel around and meet people and sort of visit all the local places. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And of course it sold a lot of papers, because in popular culture people wanted to hear about what Lord Lucan might be doing, and even if the story was completely implausible, people like the idea that even though clearly it's a horrible, heinous crime and this poor innocent young woman was killed, I think there is something that people sort of latch onto, this idea that he's kind of got away with it, and he's now, is he flipping burgers in Arkansas, or has he had plastic surgery and he's now working in a game reserve in Botswana, or is he a hippie living in Goa? There was one, I think one of the more famous sightings was of this guy who was called Jungle Barry. Does that ring any bells?
Yeah, just only because I read about this again recently, and kind of looked at some of the different theories and different, so-called sightings. That he lived as a hippie in India, and his nickname was Jungle Barry. This is from the Daily Mirror, I'm reading now.
Yeah.
Former Scotland Yard detective Duncan McLaughlin claimed in 2003 that Lord Lucan had lived as a hippie in India until his death in 1996. He claimed Lord Lucan had lived under the name Barry Halpin and was known as Jungle Barry. A photograph claiming to show a bearded, dishevelled Lucan in 1991 also bared a strong resemblance to the missing peer. That's another word for a lord. It eventually emerged that Halpin was very real, but he was from St Helens in the north of England, and was a well-known figure on the Merseyside folk music scene of the 1960s. So the idea was that this guy called Jungle Barry, this kind of hippie living in India, people got the idea that this was actually Lord Lucan in disguise, but until Jungle Barry was identified as someone from Liverpool or something Lord like Lucan. That. Yeah, definitely not Lord Lucan. But that's just one of many of those of similar theories and sightings. Do we know more?
Well, we know that in 2016 he was officially declared dead, Lord Lucan, because there was no trace of him, and the police's conclusion was that he committed suicide in the channel, the English Channel, the
That he
stretch of
walked in.
water between. Well, what he probably did. There's two theories about how he could have done it. One is that he got in the boat, and essentially he did to himself what he was planning to do to his wife, which was weigh himself down and just sink to the bottom of the sea, and that he would have cut a hole in the boat so it went down as well. The other thing too was that they found in the car, I think, an empty bottle of vodka, which indicates that he probably drank the whole bottle and then was not in a good state of mind to be making rational decisions. So that maybe he did that because that was the only way he could decide to kill himself, or some other idea that he got on a ferry and maybe threw himself off the ferry into the propellers, so he was like chopped up into little bits and stuff. I know that's not a very nice thing to be saying on a family-friendly podcast, but that's what his wife thinks.
Wow.
And yeah, there's been no trace at all, not even, I don't know, a stray foot or a little bit of his moustache or anything that has appeared. And then another theory also, I mentioned earlier that one of his friends was this guy called Aspinall, who has this zoo, that is still a zoo today, I believe, a kind of private zoo, and had tigers. And one theory is that he drove to his friend's zoo, shot himself, and said, "Feed me to the tigers."
Sorry to laugh about that. It's not really something to laugh about, but it sounds quite ridiculous.
Yes, it does sound ridiculous.
Why though? Why would he have done that? Why would he care whether his body was discovered or not, though?
I would imagine that he. I'd imagine maybe there's some shame that he wouldn't want people to think that he has killed himself.
Okay.
Maybe he thinks that it implies that he was guilty. It seems very likely that he was.
Yeah.
But perhaps in his slightly deranged state of mind, he thought, well, people will probably people will think that it was me if they see that I've killed myself. If I just disappear, then maybe there's some air of mystique, which clearly there is.
Yeah. I see. So yeah, I can see the reasons why he would want to disappear, or at least cover up for a suicide, and yeah, either sinking to the bottom of the English Channel, jumping off the back of a ferry into the propeller, God, or being eaten by tigers. Blimey.
With all these things, I guess these things sound probably far more glamorous is not the right word, but exciting or adventurous than what is most likely the truth, which is that he probably just threw himself into the sea and weighed himself down so that he wasn't washed up on a beach somewhere found by a French fisherman.
I've got a few other theories, which are quite sort of interesting. So one is that he lived in the New Zealand outback. So he lived in the countryside in New Zealand with a goat called Camilla. So again, according to the Daily Mirror, local residents deep in the New Zealand countryside claimed in 2007 that a British expat called Roger Woodgate could be Lord Lucan. He was said to have an upper-class English accent and a strong resemblance to the fugitive peer, as well as a pet possum and a goat called Camilla. I don't know how the possum and the goat, helped to identify him as Lucan. But apparently there was an upper-class English guy living out in the New Zealand countryside, and other locals decided that they were going to try and tell the police that this was Lord Lucan.
Camilla is not, I imagine, an unusual name to call your goat. I don't have a goat, but I imagine calling a goat. I imagine most goats are not called Camilla.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't know if that's any kind of connection to Queen Camilla.
In fact, I thought that rang a bell. One of his children was called Camilla.
Okay, but yeah, why would you then call a pet goat
Your goat.
after one of your children? I mean, that's a very loose connection. But in the end, it
Yeah.
seems that Mr. Woodgate, this guy, Mr. Woodgate has continually denied the claims ever since, and points out that he is 5 inches shorter and 10 years younger than Lord Lucan. So I think that probably clears that up. 5 inches shorter, that's about 12 or 13 centimetres, and 10 years younger. There's others. He was captured by police but turned out to be a Labour Member of Parliament who faked his own death. Australian police swooped just months after Lord Lucan's disappearance and arrested a man they announced that they believed was the missing Lord. But the arrest took a more incredible twist when it emerged they'd actually found dead Labour MP John Stonehouse alive and well. Stonehouse had faked his own drowning off the coast of Miami earlier that year because of financial problems. He was deported back to the UK and the search for Lord Lucan continued. So that's funny that they actually, the police in Australia caught a guy and they thought it was Lucan, but it was another guy who'd faked his own death. A British politician. The story about him being fed to tigers after he shot himself, and a few other sightings, including an ex-Nazi colony in Paraguay, at a sheep station in the Australian outback, backpacking on Mount Etna, working as a waiter in San Francisco, people seeing him in a private hospital in Johannesburg in 1995, and so on. Yeah.
He gets around, or at least sightings of him, are all over the place. And I was reading an article. I mentioned it to you before we started. An article about journalists talking about this huge chase for Lord Lucan, and one journalist talks about some advice he received from his more senior editor about this chasing of Lord Lucan, and the editor said to him, "Laddie," so young man, "you don't ever want to shoot the fox. Once the fox is dead, there's nothing left to chase." So essentially meaning that it was a lot of fun for these journalists to continue chasing Lord Lucan. They had no interest in proving that he was dead or proving that this person wasn't him. They wanted to continue this cycle of people wanting to call in and say, "Oh, excuse me, I'm just in the west of Sweden, and I think just seen Lord Lucan over there," so that a whole lot of journalists could get on a plane and go and have a little bit of an adventure, looking for him, investigating the story, and clearly the editors were happy because it would sell lots of papers as well.
Yeah, the media has always loved this story because it's just like it just keeps going, and the public are interested in it, and it's a story that people are always willing to read about and stuff, and a new Amazon Prime documentary about it, and now an episode of Luke's English podcast as well. So it is a story that sort of is quite compelling, and so you can imagine that the newspapers are quite happy to continue sort of drip feeding this story into their newspapers, because and they're quite happy to let the story continue, because it sells papers and so on.
They can't have much more than 10 years more of it, because he was born in 1934, so he would be 90 now, and I think you can't continue to say you've got sightings of him, as a hippie on a beach in Goa or working in a restaurant, unless you're talking about what is essentially a 90-year-old man. So I wonder how long. I wonder when the last sighting of Lord Lucan will be.
I wonder too. So listeners, if you feel that you've seen Lord Lucan, so a man who's about 190 centimeters tall, probably about 90 years old. So he probably isn't 190 centimeters in height anymore. With an upper class English accent and a moustache, let us know. And indeed, if you are Lord Lucan and you're listening to this, then, hand yourself into the police, do the decent thing. But in fact, in reality, the truth is probably far less interesting, glamorous or exciting than any of these theories. And as you said before, he probably killed himself when he realised what he'd done and realised the situation he was in, when the truth, dawned on him. Or he disappeared. He somehow successfully faked his death, and using his connections, maybe he was able to disappear. But I expect that would be a very difficult thing to do. Yeah,
it's fun to talk about what could have happened. But yeah, I think that the truth is perhaps less interesting than the speculation.
Yeah, indeed. Well, there you go. So that was an episode. We've done a much longer version than the original episode of your podcast here in this conversation, going into lots of detail and stuff about it. But if people want to listen to the original episode, because that episode has got a transcript and stuff like that, so they could find that original episode for the kind of shorter version, which has a transcript and so on. They can find it. Do you remember which number that is, or when it was published?
It's 354.
354. Okay, listeners, episode 354 of English Learning for Curious Minds. And of course, all the other episodes, around about 500 other episodes on all sorts of other interesting topics that you could explore. English Learning for Curious Minds. You can get it where you get your podcasts. Is that the best way for people to find it? Just that, or is your website another way that people can?
Yeah, I mean, it's all over the place now, I guess. On podcast apps, even started putting some on YouTube if you're the kind of person who likes YouTube, or on the website, which is leonardoenglish.com.
Yes,
and not all episodes contain murder, so
yeah, it's not all
don't worry.
Grisly murder stuff. There are all sorts of other interesting subjects too. Alastair, thank you very much for sharing that story with us. It's been fascinating, and I've really enjoyed finding out more about the story of Lord Lucan. It's always been something I've been interested in, after having heard his name mentioned so many times, after seeing his picture in the newspapers, hearing my parents talking about him, I was always interested in doing a podcast episode about Lord Lucan. It was always one of those things that I had in this long list of episode ideas. So it's nice to have been able to do that. And, thanks for helping to make that happen today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be invited.
All right. Okay, everyone. Great. Well, leave your comments, listeners. What do you think? Have you got any ideas? What are your thoughts in relation to this story? You can leave your comments in the comments section as usual. But Alastair, great. Have a lovely day now, and good luck with all the new episodes of the podcast which are going to be coming out and so on. What about Pioneers of the Continuum, the time travelling story? Is there going to be like a second series of that or something?
Oh, good question. I get asked that quite a bit. There's no immediate plans for a kind of season 2, because it finishes in a quite a difficult way to continue. It was meant to be a standalone thing, but there may be more like that in the future. Yeah.
Okay.
And maybe we can put a link to Pioneers of the Continuum. I put it on YouTube as well. So if people like YouTube, I know that people do like YouTube, but for those of you who love YouTube, then you can listen to it on YouTube as well.
Yeah, you'll find a link for Pioneers of the Continuum as well in the episode description. Okay, Alastair, brilliant. Thanks a lot. Have a lovely day, and speak to you again soon in some way.
You too. Thanks so much, Luke. Bye.
Cheers. Okay, so that concludes this episode. That is the end of this little journey into the world of true crime podcasting on Luke's English podcast this time. Thanks again to Alastair for preparing this episode and telling the story. Obviously, a lot of work was put into researching it, and just the way he told the story, he clearly took time to set it up and give us all the details in the right order. So thanks again to Alastair. As we just mentioned, you'll find links to other stuff in the episode description, including English Learning for Curious Minds, the podcast, and episode 354, which is the shorter version of this story on Alastair's podcast. Also, Pioneers of the Continuum, that time-travelling story that Alastair wrote, which I recorded the voice for episode 1. And Alastair's website, leonardoenglish.com, where you can find other learning English materials. Okay. All right. Well done for getting this far, everybody. I'm recording this outro bit on Wednesday, the 17th of September. No, Wednesday, the 17th of July. I'm recording this on Wednesday, the 17th of July. I think this episode has been published right at the end of July. So anyway, I hope your summer is going well, but you might be listening to this at another time in the year completely. So basically, I hope your day is going well, or if it's night time, I hope your night is going well. Whatever it is that you're in right now, I hope it's just going well. And thank you for listening all the way up until the end of this podcast. All right, I'll speak to you very soon. Okay, I'll speak to you soon on the podcast. No more rambling at the end here. That may be what I'll be doing in the next episode. Probably, right? Probably is. Okay, have a lovely afternoon, morning, evening, or night, and I will speak to you next time. But for now, it's time to say goodbye. Bye. Bye. Bye.